Howard Phillips Lovecraft, August 20, 1890, March 15, 1937. Is an American author of horror, fantasy, poetry, and science fiction, especially the subgenre known as weird fiction. Lovecraft's guiding aesthetic and philosophical principle is the idea that life is incomprehensible to human minds and that the universal force that rules everything is inimical to the interests of humankind. Lovecraft's readership was limited during his lifetime, and his reputation has grown over the decades, being now regarded as one of the most influential horror writers of the 20th century. Lovecraft was born on August 20, 1890 in Rhode Island. He was the only child of Winfred Scott Lovecraft, a traveling salesman of jewelry and precious metals, as well as Sarah Susan Phillips Lovecraft, only son. In 1893, when Lovecraft was 3, his father became acutely psychotic in a Chicago hotel room while on a business trip and was taken back to Providence and placed in Butler Hospital, when he remained until his death in 1898. Lovecraft maintained throughout his life that his father had died in a condition of paralysis brought on by nervous exhaustion due to overwork, but this is now almost certain that the actual cause was paralysis due to syphilis. After his father's hospitalization, Lovecraft was raised by his mother, his 2 aunts, and his maternal grandfather. Lovecraft was a prodigy, reciting poetry at the age of 3 and writing complete poems by 6. Beginning his early life, Lovecraft was believed to have suffered from night terrors, a rare paranoia disorder. He believed himself to be assaulted at night by horrific night gaunts. His father encouraged him to read, providing him classics such as The Arabian Nights, Bullfinch, Ace of Fable, and children's versions of the Iliad and the Odyssey. His grandfather also stirred the boy's interest in the weird by telling him his own original tales of Gothic horror. Lovecraft was frequently ill as a child. Due to this very sickly nature, he barely attended school until he was 8 years old, and then was withdrawn after a year. He read voraciously during this period and became especially enamored of chemistry and astronomy. He produced several ectographed publications with a limited circulation beginning in 1899 with the Scientific Gazette. 4 years later, he returned to public school at Hope High School in Rhode Island. Much of his later work is thought to have been directly inspired by the night terrors. Indeed, Night Gaunts became the subject of a poem he wrote on the same name, in which they were personified as devil-like creatures without faces. His grandfather's death in 1904 greatly affected Lovecraft's life. Mismanagement of his grandfather's estate left his family in a poor financial situation, and they were forced to move into much smaller accommodations. In 1908, prior to his high school graduation, he himself claimed to have suffered what he later described as a nervous breakdown, and consequently never received his high school diploma. Although he maintained for most of his life that he did graduate, S.T. Joshi suggested in his biography of Lovecraft that a primary cause for this breakdown was his difficulty in higher mathematics, a subject needed to master to become a professional astronomer. Lovecraft wrote some fiction as a youth, but from 19 until 19 13, his output was primarily poetry. During that time, he lived an hermit existence, having almost no contact with anyone but his mother. This changed when he wrote a letter to the Argosy. The ensuing debate caught the eye of Edward F. Das, president of the United Amateur Press Association, UAPA for its sake, who invited Lovecraft to join them. The UAPA reinvigorated Lovecraft and incited him to contribute many poems and essays. Around that time, he began to build up a huge network of correspondence. His lengthy and frequently missives would make him one of the great letter writers of the century. Among his correspondents were Robert Bloch, Psycho, Clark Ashton Smith, and Robert E. Howard, author of Conan the Barbarian series. In 1919, after suffering from hysteria and depression for a long period of time, Lovecraft's mother was committed to Butler Hospital, just as his husband had been. The period after Lovecraft returned to Providence, the last decade of his life, after a very marking and strongly impressing period of life in New York City, especially in Brooklyn, made Lovecraft very sensitive and made of this period the most prolific of Lovecraft. In that time, he produced short stories for the leading pulp publication of the day, primarily weird tales, as well as longer efforts, such as the case of Charles Dexter Ward and At the Mountain of Madness. About the themes. Several themes recur in Lovecraft stories. On this topic, he mentioned in a note to the editor of Weird Tales the following: Now, all my tales are based on the fundamental premise that common human laws and interests and emotions have no validity or significance in the vast cosmos at large. To me, there is nothing but purely in a tale in which the human form and the local human passions and conditions and standards are depicted as native to other worlds or other universes. To achieve the essence of real externality, whether of time or space or dimension, one must forget that such things as organic life, good and evil, love and hate, and all such local attributes of a negligible and temporary race called mankind have any existence at all. Only the human essence and characters must have human qualities. This must be inhaled with unsparing realism, not catch-penny romanticism, but when we cross the line to the boundless and hideous unknown, the shadow, haunted outside, we must remember to leave our humanity and terrestrialism at the threshold. Some of the topics he mentions during his works in general include forbidden knowledge. Many of his characters are driven by curiosity or scientific endeavor, and in many of his stories, the knowledge they uncover proves Promethean in nature, either filling the seeker with regret for what they have learned, destroying them psychologically, or completely destroying the person who holds the knowledge. Non-human influences on humanity is another theme. The beings of Lovecraft's mythos often have human or mostly human servants. These worshippers serve as a useful narrative purpose for Lovecraft. Many beings of the mythos were too powerful to be defeated by human opponents, and so terribly horrific that direct knowledge of them meant insanity for the victim. Human followers gave him a way to reveal information about their goods in a diluted form, and also made it possible for his protagonists to win paltry victories. Lovecraft, like his contemporaries, envisioned savages as closer to supernatural knowledge unknown to civilized men. The inherent guilt is another recurring theme in Lovecraft's stories, and is the idea that descendants in a bloodline can never escape the stain of crimes committed by their forebears, at least if the crimes are atrocious enough. Descendants may be very far removed, both in place and in time, and indeed in culpability, from the act itself, and yet they may be haunted by the revenant past. Fate often works in the protagonist, but who is not in control of his own actions or finds it impossible to change course, similar to classic Greco-Roman drama. A runaway either never arises or is somehow correlated by some outside force. Often, his characters are subject to a compulsive influence from a powerful, malevolent, or indifferent beings. As with the inevitability of one's ancestry, eventually, even running away or death itself provides no safety. In some cases, this doom is manifest in the entire of humanity, and no escape is possible. The civilization under threat was a proof of Lovecraft's familiarity with the work of the German conservative revolutionary theorist Oswald Spengler, whose pessimistic thesis on the decadence of the modern West formed a crucial element in Lovecraft's overall anti-modern worldview. Lovecraft was also acquainted with the writing of another German philosopher of the decadence, Friedrich Nietzsche. Lovecraft frequently dealt with the idea of civilization struggling against dark, primitive barbarism. In some stories, this struggle is at an individual level. Many of his protagonists are cultured, highly educated men who are gradually corrupted by some obscure and fear influence. Physical and mental degradation often come together. This theme of tainted blood may represent concerns relating to Lovecraft's own family story, especially the death of his father due to what Lovecraft must have suspected to be a syphilitic disorder. In some other tales, an entire society is threatened by the barbarism. Sometimes an isolated pocket of humanity falls into decadence and atavisms of its own accord. But most often, such stories involve a civilized culture being gradually undermined by a malevolent underclass influenced by inhuman forces.